Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. It's been a few weeks, you know what that means. It's time for another Anbernic review. Now this one is called the RG406V, and even though they've been releasing device after device all year, thankfully they only really fall into one of two camps. We've got the cheaper devices, those with an XX designator. Those are going to be, usually around $60 or $70, and these ones will play up to like PS1 and then a few other systems as well. Now this one falls into the other camp, which is going to be the high-spec devices, like the RG556 and the RG406V. Both of those have the same chipset as this one. So already we know what to expect when it comes to the RG406V in terms of performance, power, as well as price point. This one's going to be around $160. However, there are two aspects that are kind of debuting with this handheld that are pretty darn exciting for me. The first is that we finally have replacements for those Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons that you were probably used to with the other Anbernic devices. These new sticks follow the same design that we've seen with Retroid and AYN, so they have a true analog input and they are awesome. In addition, this screen is an update, so this one has a 960 by 720 resolution, which is the first time we've seen an upgrade over 480p on a 4x3 display from Anbernic. And as I'll show in this video, that means that some systems are going to look amazing on here. And so it does feel like this device is a bit of the same old Anbernic that we know and love. They use the same chipset we've seen previously. They're even using a design that we've seen last year as well. But of course, there are a couple new features that I'm excited about, not necessarily for this handheld, but for future handhelds that they release. As always, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so grab a snack and drink, and let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, as always, we'll start with the specs, and the CPU here is the Unisoc T820, and this is the same 8-core chip that we've seen on the RG556 as well as the RG406V. And obviously we'll go over performance later in the video, but just in a quick nutshell, that means that most PS2 and GameCube games are going to play reliably well. The device also comes with 8GB of LPDDR4X RAM and 128GB of internal storage. And of course, you can expand that storage with a microSD card if you'd like as well. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, the display is a new debut from Anbernic. It's 4 inches large and has a 960 by 720 resolution. And this resolution actually makes it a perfect 4x integer scale when it comes to Game Boy Advance and a 5x integer scale with Game Boy and Game Boy Color. We've also got a pretty chunky battery. It's 5500 mAh, which gives us between 4 and 8 hours of gameplay depending on the type of games that you're playing. So if you really want to push it with GameCube, it's going to give you about 4 hours, but if you're going to be playing lightweight stuff, you can get 8 hours and beyond. As far as connectivity, we've got 5 GHz Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth 5.0, and the device is running Android 13. And a couple other features is that it has USB-C DisplayPort out up to 1080p, and then we've got those new upgraded Hall sensor analog sticks, which we will talk about in depth here in a moment. Now, the device is not fully released yet. It'll be coming out in a couple days, and I'll have links down below when they go live. But I do know what the price is going to be. It's going to be $165 MSRP, but they will have a $10 coupon when it first launches. And so for the first 72 hours, it's going to be $155 plus shipping as opposed to $165. But also bear in mind that these devices will go on sale often, and so if you don't want to spend that full $165 plus shipping, just wait a little bit, and you'll see those sales on AliExpress and even their website. Regardless, I think this is a pretty good price point, somewhere between $150 and $200 for this level of performance. Let's get started with an unboxing and impressions. Now, this was a review unit sent over from Anbernic, but like with all my other videos, all impressions are my own. No money was exchanged in any way, and they're not going to be seeing this video ahead of time. And they are releasing 3 different color options for this device. I have the gray and white ones here for review, but I don't have the transparent black. Inside the box is your standard Anbernic kind of setup, so we have the device itself, and then underneath a couple goodies. We've got a screen protector as well as some wipes, and then also a USB-C charging cable, and then also a quick user manual. Now, one thing worth noting, because this is an Android-based device, you're not going to have a lot of the charging limitations you will get with other Anbernic handhelds like the cheaper ones. So even though, yes, you could use the USB-A to USB-C cable that comes with it, you could also just use a standard USB-C to USB-C cable and even a fast charger. All that's going to work. So let's take a look at the device itself, and this is the white model, and I gotta say, it actually looks pretty good. This is very similar to the other one that they released of the RG406V that has a little bit of an off-white color. I'm not sure if my camera's gonna pick it up perfectly, but you might be able to see that this is a little bit more yellowed on the case itself compared to like the white buttons. And it's gonna be the same case here where the D-pad and the analog sticks, all of these are brighter white than the off-white color here, which is more like a beige on the actual case. Now, like I mentioned, I also have the gray model, and this is the one I've actually been setting up for the past couple days. these, and I gotta say, I really like this color a lot better. I love the fact that they have the Super Nintendo European style layout here, but then also it has that same circle and the gray and the lighter gray that you usually would see on the old Super Nintendo controller, and so I really think that's pretty awesome. So I think all told, these are both pretty good looking devices, but if I had to choose between the two, I prefer the gray model just because the color contrasts are a little bit more appealing. I do like the cleaner look of the white model, but the fact that the buttons are a different color than the case itself does drive me a little crazy. So let's talk a little bit about my impressions with the device besides just the colors, and I will say that the first thing is the texture of the plastic feels really good. It has a little bit of a texture to it, not a lot, but I would say it's not slick, it has a little bit of a grit to it. And overall, I do really like this type of texture on the Anbernic plastic models, and so this is probably one of the best that they've released. My next impression has to do with the overall feel and look of the device because it is very familiar. And that's because they've already released a device that's very similar. The one on the left is the Anbernic RG406V. It came out about a year ago at this point. It's very similar to this one. It's also based on Android. It uses a Unisoc chipset, but it is a little bit less powerful. This one caps out at about PSP. It can play a good amount of PS2 and GameCube games, but nothing like what we'll see here with the 406V here today. But you can see just from an overall design perspective, they are nearly identical. There's a few little differences that we'll get into, but otherwise it's a very similar setup. And I did a couple videos about this device, first an impressions, then an in-depth review, and I thought it was pretty good. I like the fact that it has a 4-inch display, but yes, this is a very large and bulky handheld. In fact, it feels a little bit bloated, all things considered. The way I've been describing it is that both of these devices kind of feel like they've been soaking in water overnight, like they just have a bloated kind of look to them. But I think there's also some benefits to that as well, which we'll get into when we talk about ergonomics and overall comfort. Now, even though this device does feel relatively bulky, that comes with some added benefits, and the number one thing here is going to be ergonomics. There's a lot of space here to be able to hold this device comfortably. And a lot of this has to do with the somewhat awkward placement of the grips here on the back. It looks strange at first glance, but when you get used to it, it's actually pretty handy. So first and foremost, these grips, as you can see here on the back, are pretty bulky. They stick out quite a bit from the case, and they do come down in a straight line, but it's been angled outward just slightly, and that does make it pretty comfortable to hold. On top of that, here on the bottom, we've got these two little divots that are supposed to be placement for your fingers. Now, at first glance, you might think that that's a place to put your pinky, but I've never really found that to be a good fit. Instead, I use it with my ring finger. And so this is generally how I hold the device. I have my index finger up here resting on these shoulders and triggers, and then I have my middle finger gripping it right here, which gives me my main anchor point. From there, my ring finger rests below it, and then my pinky is underneath it. And so when I'm actually holding it, this is kind of the setup that I have, and it's a really comfortable grip overall. Personally, I've never really found vertical handhelds to be super comfortable to hold, just because you are kind of gripping them like this, and so it gives you a little bit less room to hold. If you look at a horizontal device like the RG Cube, you can see that I have just a lot more space for my hands, and so this overall feels like a more comfortable grip. And I think that any handheld manufacturer has an uphill battle when it comes to vertically oriented handhelds, just because they are not quite as comfortable as something that gives you a little bit more space. And so even though the design overall is a little bit funky looking, I think that it serves a purpose. And so yeah, it's bulky, but overall I think that it is pretty comfortable, especially for a vertical handheld. Now personally, I prefer a flat back when it comes to a vertical handheld, and I've talked about this a lot in my videos, but I think this gives you a lot more freedom of where to actually place your hand. You don't have any grips telling you what to do. And so personally, if we're talking about a 4-inch handheld with a vertical orientation, I do like the one that we have here with the 40XX-V, just because it feels a little bit more compact and gives you a little bit more freedom in terms of where you can put your fingers. So if anything, I would say that this feels more like playing on an upgraded and updated version of the DMG, while this one feels a little bit more like a Frankenstein's monster. But don't get me wrong, I think it's still a very comfortable handheld, and I think if you're looking for a compromise between something that kind of feels like a horizontal one while still giving you that vertical orientation, this is a pretty good fit right here. But there is certainly no denying the fact that this thing does just look a little bit bloated. Now, we've been talking about the back for quite a bit, so let's keep going and talk about some of the other features here. First, I want to talk about the shoulder and trigger buttons. So these are all in a line and a bit on a slope altogether, as you can see, and they have a bit of a ski slope ramp to them. And this is very similar to what we've been seeing with other handhelds from Anbernic and other manufacturers. In fact, if we look at the 40XX-V, you can see that they are almost identical in terms of design. One thing worth noting is I find these buttons to be quite a bit softer and quieter than other devices that they've released, even recently. Let me give you a quick audio test so you can hear what they sound like. By comparison, here is the 40XX-V. And so these are a little bit louder than the one we're reviewing today, but I do like the fact that these are probably some of the quietest ones we found in a vertical Anbernic handheld. One other thing worth noting is that the size of the buttons have changed. As you can see here, the L1 and R1 buttons are thinner on today's model compared to the one from last year. And I think that's a good thing because there were quite a few people who would accidentally press on these buttons when they were playing because they were just right here flush with the side of the case. I even saw that some people were putting like little pieces of paper right here just to make these buttons not trigger as easily. Now personally, I never really accidentally would push these buttons when I was playing, but I think that it is going to be a lot more improved on this one. And so if that was ever an issue with this model, I don't think you're going to see it with this one at all. And that's because we got this little lip right here. And so if we're resting our finger, it doesn't feel like I'm going to press this just on its own. Either way, I do like the setup of these buttons. They are nice and easy to press down on. They're not too loud, and they both have a digital input as well. And finally, on the back here, we've got an active cooling fan, the same fan that we've seen with other Anbernic devices, including the RG406V, which has the same chipset. And to be honest, these fans in general have not really served much of a purpose at all, unless you're going to be playing some really high-end PS2 games. That's really going to be the only time where you'll probably feel it kicking in. The nice thing about this design in general is that the CPU is up here, and so as the device starts heating up, it's not actually going to affect your gameplay because your hands are going to be down here, so even if this does get warm around this area, which honestly I haven't really seen in all of my testing, it's not really going to affect your ambient heat when you're holding the device. That's been a common issue with a lot of other horizontal handhelds, which have the CPU somewhere here in the middle. Now in terms of fan settings, we got quite a few. The first is just to turn it off. Then we have an auto setting, which will ramp up when it needs it. Then we have a low or a cool setting, and then strong. Now I've got this running at full speed, and it's definitely audible, but I would say it's not distracting and not a bad sound altogether. If anything, I would say while playing a game, I would probably turn up my volume by about 10%. That way I can mask that volume, but it's really not that much. So I'm going to cycle between off and then full blast and see if you can catch it. So yeah, chances are you probably weren't able to hear that at all, and that's how quiet this fan is, so I don't think it's a big deal at all. So now let's take a look at the front, and I want to start with the controls, and we'll kind of work our way up to the screen. To start, I think we should talk about these analog sticks, because I think these are the first major upgrade we've seen with Anbernic analog sticks in years at this point. So as far as I can tell, these are using the same style sticks that we've seen with Retroid and AYN products here in the past. These are Hall sensor sticks that have a full range of motion, and they feel really good compared to the previous ones, which were modeled more after the Nintendo Switch. If we look at the older models, you can see that the stick just kind of flops over to the side, and so we only have a little bit of range of motion, and even then it just doesn't feel very smooth. And bear in mind, these are also Hall sensor sticks, so the best that Anbernic has been able to offer over the past couple of years. Now, by comparison, these new sticks just move all over the place. Look at how much range of motion I have, and they feel super smooth and nice. In fact, I think these are probably from the same manufacturer that we've seen between Retroid and AYN. For example, even though they kind of look like Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons here on the caps, these caps actually pull right off, and the connection here is almost identical to what we've seen previously. For example, here's the stick on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. It does have a different design to it, but it pops right off, and so this actually will fit directly on the Anbernic as well. And so I do think that they are probably using the same manufacturer, and I think that's a great thing. And so I love the fact that we can not only swap out these caps, but it's the same style of stick. In fact, you can find 3D printed versions of these caps as well, and so there's just a lot of room to work with when it comes to these sticks, and I hope that they stick with them for future products. To be honest, if Anbernic wanted to go back and re-release some of their devices but with better sticks, I think it would greatly improve them. The RG556 is probably the best example. This one actually has the same chipset as the device that we're reviewing today, and it has a 5.5-inch OLED display, and it's wonderful. The only thing that really holds me back from using this device more often are these analog sticks, because they have the old Nintendo Switch style ones. And so I've always found that these sticks are what are holding this device back, because it's super ergonomic, it's fun to play with, it's got analog triggers, it looks really nice, it's got a lot of power to it, but I never like playing modern games with these sticks. So I'm definitely hoping that this becomes the standard stick from Anbernic in the future, because this will really improve the gameplay in a lot of different devices. Another thing worth noting is that these sticks behave exactly as I would expect when it comes to the analog style input. So as I move it around, I've got a full range of motion, no cardinal snapping, everything feels really good. In fact, when playing any sort of 3D based game, it feels really excellent. So not only does the hardware feel better, but it almost seems like they've improved the software as well. So I think in terms of just overall quality of life improvements, this is probably the biggest jump I've seen in an Anbernic device in a while, and it's really long overdue because a lot of other devices have had these really great sticks, and it's great that Anbernic has finally caught up. And you can immediately tell the difference when playing any game that requires an analog input. For example, here with Mario 64, I can easily make Mario walk, or I can make him run, and I can go in any direction that I please. Now, if you swipe down from the top-down menu, you have the ability to change out the RGB lights. So in addition to changing out the pattern, if you long press on the button, you actually get a bunch of different options as well. So this is where you would go if you want to adjust the brightness or the color, things like that. Personally, I kind of like the rainbow lighting, so I'm just going to leave it on the default settings. But just bear in mind, you do have the ability to change out the color to whatever you want. You can even add in the RGB values if you want to get really into the nitty-gritty. So overall, yes, I think it's a big improvement that we have these new analog sticks. I love the full range of motion. I'm not super hip on the Nintendo Switch style cap on top, but honestly, I will take this motion over anything else. Okay, let's move on and talk about the D-pad. And so this D-pad is very typical Anbernic. It's a rubber membrane connection, and it feels really good to the touch. Anbernic has made some really excellent D-pads over the years, and this is probably one of the better ones that are out there. In terms of pivot and travel, everything feels very much so like a Super Nintendo D-pad, but maybe a little bit more tactile. So let's do a couple tests, starting with the contra test. So I'm going to press down on the D-pad, then wiggle it back and forth. You can see here that if I'm just wiggling it lightly, the character will not actually move, but if I try to really push it to one side or the other, I can move the character. And so this is ideal when it comes to a D-pad. I want to be able to hit a diagonal when I want to, but I also don't want to if I'm going to go straight up or down. And so I think from a functional standpoint, this is probably one of the better D-pads that Anbernic has released as well. In fact, it feels almost identical to the last device they released, which was the RG406V, and so I think they probably are using the same membranes and the same D-pad even. So I would say that Anbernic is 2 for 2 when it comes to D-pad over the past 2 device releases. And just to be thorough, let's do a quick Street Fighter 3 Third Strike test, and yeah, this one also passes really well. I am missing an input here or there, but that's partly a skill issue, and then I also have to acclimate to each D-pad and device in general. But I can tell you that just after a couple minutes of testing, I feel confident in that if I played with this for about a week or so, I would be able to nail all this no problem. Okay, let's talk about the face buttons next, and really not a lot to talk about here. These are very typical Anbernic, so they are a rubber membrane connection. They have a good amount of travel to them. They don't have a lot of wiggle or anything to them either, and so yeah, I think these are excellent buttons. I have the same kind of complaints about these as I do with any other device in that they are a little bit on the small side and kind of cramped together, but this is kind of the size and overall layout that they use with Anbernic devices. And to be honest, it might feel a little bit weird at first, but once you get used to it, I've never really found a problem with the overall size and feel. Other than that, in the center, we have our home and back button. So if you just tap on it, it'll be a back button. If you press and hold it for a couple seconds, it'll function as home within Android. And this one has a clicky micro switch connection to it, so it's a little bit louder than the others and doesn't have a lot of travel to it, but it still feels pretty good and it's not super loud. And then finally on the bottom, we have our select and start buttons. These are also rubber membrane buttons, and you've got quite a bit of travel here and they are nice and quiet. Looking at the bottom, we've got a headphone jack as well as our 2 stereo speakers, which are downward firing. Let's do a quick audio test. Okay, those speakers are super loud, so there's not going to be any issue in masking over any sort of fan noise because these speakers get probably like 25% louder than I would ever need them to be. In terms of audio quality, I think it sounds pretty good. You can definitely hear the high tones better than the lower stuff, but that's pretty typical with these smaller handhelds. So overall, I would say the speakers are pretty good on here. They're not going to blow you away, and I do wish that they were front firing, but obviously we don't have a lot of room to work with. So if anything, I would say that these speakers at least get the job done. On the right side, we've got our volume up and down and then our power and sleep button. So if we tap on this, it'll put it to sleep like any other Android device. And then of course, if we press and hold the power button, it'll bring up the power menu. On the left side, we've got a slot for our micro SD card for expanded storage. And then we have our Anbernic button. This is going to bring up their front end. And I went into detail about that Anbernic front end in my RG405 review last year, and so I'll leave that link down below if you want to get more details about that overall process. But in a nutshell, it's set up so that if you press this button, it'll bring up their front end, and then from there, if you buy one of their cards that are preloaded with games, you can actually sync it with this device, and so you'll be able to navigate through and pick your games directly from here. And you don't have to use it with Anbernic's card. In fact, you could just load up your own games, but it does make the process a lot easier. For my part, I prefer to use third-party front ends like Emulation Station, and that's what we're going to be showing off here in this video. And then finally up top, we've got a USB-C port. This will work with charging and is also capable of video out, but not when you're charging the device at the same time. So if you wanted to plug this into a USB-C hub to be able to charge it and play it on a TV, unfortunately, that's just not going to work with this chipset, at least on these Anbernic devices. And we've seen the same thing with all three devices that Anbernic has released with this chipset. So you can plug these into a TV via USB-C, but you're not going to be able to charge it at the same time. Thankfully, the batteries on these are relatively large, and so you can play these for several hours and you don't have to worry about charging them. And then finally, let's talk about this screen. So there are a couple things I really love about it, like the fact that it's using an upgraded resolution and it's also 4 inches in size. But there's also a couple things that prevent me from loving it as much as I could. And to be honest, there's two things I don't like about this screen. One is a fair judgment, and the other one is totally biased and unfair. Now, the first thing I don't like about this screen is that we have a fairly large bezel. Not only the physical bezel here within the LCD panel, but then also we've got a lot of bezel in the case on each side. And again, I think this is just a natural result of using a device that is so big and chunky. And so even though this is a big screen, 4 inches with the 4x3 display is pretty awesome, it just doesn't feel as big as it could. If we go back to that previous device, which is the 40XX-V, you can see that it has such thin bezels on the sides of the case, and so I think this works out really well. Now, there are some bezels around the LCD panel itself, but you can see that the screen itself just looks a lot bigger, even though these are both 4 inches in size. And so personally, I found that the 4-inch display on this one is super impressive, whereas this one just feels a little bit smaller than it could be. So that's the first thing that I kind of don't like about this screen, and just the fact that it doesn't feel as big and impressive as it really could. Now, the second thing I don't like about this screen is super personal, but it's the fact that this is an upgraded resolution. It's now 960 by 720. And this is the first time we've seen a 4x3 display from Anbernic with this size resolution. I think it's awesome. But the thing is, this screen is so good that it makes me wish that we had it in other devices. For example, the one that just came out last month. Again, it's almost like those analog sticks and the fact that I really am happy that they made this big upgrade, but it also makes me wish that they would now release that same screen with all the other devices they've released previously. Because I would love to have a 720p display on this device as well. If anything, it makes it harder to recommend any previous Anbernic device, because now that they've got these sticks and the screens fixed, I'm hoping that we will see that in all the future models. And so if you are contemplating a previously released Anbernic device, it might be in your best interest to just wait so we have those better parts. And I think it really comes part and parcel with a company that releases a new handheld like every month, because that means that every time they release a new one, they just keep getting better and better, but it also makes it harder to recommend the previous models as well. So at some point, we might finally get that Goldilocks device that has good analog sticks, a nice big screen with a high resolution, and a decent chipset and good controls as well. Up until now, basically every Anbernic device has had some sort of weird compromise, be it something with the analog sticks or the screen, maybe the D-pad was off or it had some internal heating. But honestly, they keep getting better and better, and so it's really hard to say, yeah, buy some of their older devices, because I know full well that a month or two from now, it might get even better. Now, as for the screen itself, we'll talk about this more in detail when I do my gameplay testing, but I will say that the 720p resolution right here is a welcome change. This is going to give us more options when it comes to scaling, but then also the screen itself seems to be very good. For example, in terms of dimness and brightness, you can see it gets quite bright as well as very dim, and so you've got a lot of range to work with here. If you want to play this in the dark, you totally can, but then also in a well-lit environment, for example outdoors, you can definitely do that too. Also, I think the overall colors and contrast look really good too. This seems to have a little bit deeper blacks than I was expecting, especially for an LCD panel. And so you can see here that with the brighter area like the sun here in Horizon Chase, it will graduate into the darker areas and it looks really nice. You can see the red color on the car really pops as well. It's not quite as apparent here on the screen in this video, but when I'm looking at the screen dead on, yeah, it looks really good. In addition, we've got some good viewing angles as well. It does get a little bit dimmer when you look at it to the side, but in general, I think this is going to be great for a handheld. One thing worth noting about this device is that it's pretty heavy. You can see here it's 289 grams. And this really is an added consequence of having a device that is so chunky and comfortable. You can see that it's quite a bit heavier than other Anbernic devices that I wouldn't call lightweight. For example, the RG406V, which I reviewed last month, is 216 grams by comparison. Another 4-inch Anbernic device is the 40XXH, and you can see here this one is even lighter. It's also heavier than the Anbernic RG406V, again with a 4-inch display, although this one is a square aspect ratio. But there are heavier Anbernic devices like the 556. This one is actually 347 grams. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the software experience and what you can expect when you first turn on the device. This is going to be an Android-based handheld, which means it's going to look very similar to any sort of Android phone or tablet. It will come preloaded with a bunch of emulators and whatnot, but I generally recommend just removing those and then adding them yourself. In fact, I have a written guide on my website that will walk you through the process. It's the same as the RG556 and the RG406V. So what I've done here is I've already removed all of the emulators they had preloaded on there, especially because some of them are older versions or they're pirated versions of paid apps. But thankfully, we do have access to the Google Play Store, and you can always sideload your own as well. Now, in terms of the overall Android interface, it's going to be very similar to what you've seen before. So you can go in here and adjust your settings much like you would on a phone. But we do have some special options within the top-down menu. So we have the ability to change on what they call high mode. This is supposed to be the performance mode, but I found that between the two, I haven't really seen any sort of difference when it comes to performance. And it's really been that way this entire time with all of the Anbernic Android builds, so I'm not really sure why they have this in there. In addition, we've got a toggle button for their front end, so you can just access it from here instead of pressing the button. This is also where you can go in to set your different fan profiles as well. On the second screen, we've got a couple other options, including the ability to change out our RGB settings. And then also you can change out the A, B, and XY layout of your buttons. By default, it's going to be in Nintendo Switch mode, which has the A button on the right side, but you can also switch it into Xbox mode, which is what I would recommend when using Android apps. Just bear in mind that if you turn it on Xbox mode and then you restart the device, it's going to revert back to Nintendo Switch mode, so you have to toggle it off and then on again. In addition, on the bottom, you can change out either having analog or digital inputs, but because these are actual digital triggers, it's not going to change anything. Now, another Android function is they have a key mapper, so you can long press on this and it'll bring up the key mapping function. So you can use this with games that only have touch style controls. Now, it's definitely a little bit difficult to move these buttons around because we have a somewhat small screen, and you can tell that the screen is not made with a 4:3 aspect ratio in mind. And so moving around some of these buttons can be quite a pain just because there's not a lot of space to work with. But the overall idea is that you can drag these buttons to wherever you would like on the screen, and then once you hit the save button, then when you press the button to whatever it corresponds to on the screen, it should work. However, this also highlights one of the downsides of the screen in that the touch inputs are not as accurate as I would like. For example, here, I want to grab this left D-pad button and move it down here, but I'm having a really hard time selecting it so that I can drag it down. And it really gets pretty hard when you get near the edge of the screen. And so this is a really great example here in that even after a few minutes of testing it, I wasn't able to move this down into the place that I want it to be. And so unfortunately, yeah, I'm trying here pretty hard to just move this over and I just can't get it. And so this is one of those things where it's a little bit frustrating. You should be able to use their software to move things around, but because of the layout and just the overall design, it actually doesn't work out. A good way to demonstrate that is to go into a touchscreen testing app. So if I go into a single touch section, what should happen here is when I move my finger around, it should be able to fill out every single place that I touch. But you'll find that as I drag it around, there will be many squares that just don't get actually inputted. And it does get pretty challenging around the edges. You can really fill it out, but you have to go over it a couple times just to make sure that everything is really touched. And so I found compared to other devices like a phone, this does seem to be a little bit less touch friendly. It's not going to really be a big deal when you're playing games other than an occasional Nintendo DS game. The only time I've really found it to be a pain is when trying to input text with the on-screen keyboard. But even then, this is not something that I would generally do very often with a retro gaming console. So yes, it is a bit of a pain in the butt, but not a deal breaker for me. Anyway, that's really about it when it comes to the software section. The biggest thing I did here is I downloaded and installed all my favorite ROMs, and then I used, of course, an SD card that had all my games on it. And then I'm using Emulation Station Desktop Edition as my main front end. And so this is generally what I will use when I'm setting up my Android-based devices. The theme right here is called Iconic, and I think it looks really good here on this 4:3 screen. So once I have everything set up, I can actually set this as my main front end launcher. So when I start up the console, it'll actually start up with this app. From there, I can just navigate through all my different consoles and then the games list themselves and then pick my game and then launch it from here. And if you have any questions about this kind of setup, I have links to a written guide in the video description below. Okay, next we're going to jump into performance testing. I want to test out basically what the chipset can do in terms of performance power, but then also some of the benefits that will come with a 720p resolution 4:3 aspect ratio screen. Before we jump into that, I do want to talk a little bit about kind of the trio or trilogy of different handheld devices we have from Anbernic that all use the same chipset. So because all three devices use the exact same chipset, the amount of performance that we'll get here is pretty similar, but I do think that because of the shape and size of each of them, they might be used in different ways. For example, with the RG556, this one has a 5.5-inch screen that's OLED as well as 16:9 aspect ratio. So this will be better suited for wider screen systems. Things like PlayStation Portable in particular will look really good here. I also think this is an ideal handheld for game streaming other than the fact that we have those older analog sticks. Meanwhile, we've got the RG Cube. This one has a 4-inch display, but it's a 1:1 square aspect ratio. And we went over a lot of that stuff in the review of the RG Cube, but one of the places where this shines is that it's a very diverse screen. For example, playing games that have a more square aspect ratio, things like Game Boy, Game Boy Color, they look amazing on the screen. Also, because it's a taller screen, that means you can play 3DS and DS games top and bottom, and it looks pretty good. And then finally, when playing 4:3 content, it looks pretty good here as well, although you will have black bars at the top and bottom, just because it is a square aspect ratio. So the strengths of these two handhelds are different from the one we're reviewing today. I would say the 556 is going to be better for widescreen gaming, whereas the RG Cube is nice and compact, but also works well in most aspect ratios. I would say that the RG406V splits the difference between the two because it's a 4:3 screen. That means that most of those older systems will play natively. In addition, because it's 4 inches, you can play 16:9 content and it doesn't look half bad. And because we got a 960x720p resolution, that means we have a lot of other scaling options, which we'll talk about when we get into those other systems. Okay, now let's get to the fun stuff and actually talk about what it's like to game on this device in terms of both the screen itself as well as the performance of this chipset. We'll start with the easy stuff like Game Boy and then work our way up, although I do think that each of these consoles are going to be a little bit interesting in their own right. When it comes to Game Boy and Game Boy Color, probably the best thing about this screen is that it is a perfect 5x integer scale. This means that all of the pixels are going to be perfectly balanced and it's going to look nice and chunky as well. And so playing both Game Boy and Game Boy Color on this device are really a joy. In addition to this screen, it's also just a good fit for this form factor. We have, something that has a 5x integer scale overall, but then also it kind of reminds me of playing with a Game Boy just because of the overall shape and size. I would say there are definitely sleeker options out there when it comes to playing Game Boy games, but it is nice to have that 5x integer scale, but then also that nice chunky DMG feel as well. Another system that benefits from the resolution of the screen is Game Boy Advance. This is actually a perfect 4x integer scale right here. So again, if you're looking for a very chunky sort of experience where you have these perfectly balanced pixels, this is going to do it really well. And so even though it is a bit of an awkward fit when it comes to playing a vertical form factor device with Game Boy Advance, I think it still works out really well, especially with that integer scaling. Another handheld system that has a perfect integer scale is actually PlayStation Portable. This is a 2x integer scale. Now this device is plenty powerful to be able to play beyond a 2x resolution upscale. In fact, you can probably play this at a 3x or 4x resolution for most games. However, just bear in mind that because of the pixel density here, you're not going to be able to see any additional pixels past a 2x scale. And honestly, I think that's actually a pretty good thing because you can play these games at the max resolution of the screen without taxing the hardware. This means you'll be able to get between 6 and 8 hours of gameplay on this battery just because you're not going to be taxing it too much. Not only that, when playing with a 4-inch screen like this, that means that when playing 16:9 content, it's still going to be about 3.7 inches, so it's still plenty big. It'll be a little bit smaller than the original PSP screen, which was 4.3 inches, but I still think that it looks nice and compact. Speaking of other handheld systems, let's talk about Nintendo DS next. So this one has originally 2 different 4:3 aspect ratio screens, which means that when showing only one screen at a time, it is going to fill up the entire screen. You've got other options, like you could show them side by side or up and down, but honestly, I think it's better just to play it like one big screen at a time like this. And so this does mean that you probably only want to focus on games where you only are going to be showing one screen at a time. I think Mario Kart is an excellent example. You can just play it like this, and if you need to see the second screen, you can always set it to a hotkey like this to be able to toggle between the map and then, of course, the actual gameplay. So inherently, Nintendo DS is going to be a compromised experience just because a 4:3 display isn't going to work out really well when it comes to showing 2 screens at a time. Now, I mentioned it before, but when using a touchscreen interface, for example, when playing a Nintendo DS game, it's not the best thing in the world. Like, I think that this could probably be a little bit better, but for my part, I think that it's at least getting the job done. I would say it's not going to be a perfect fit for really precise games like Trauma Center like this, but in general, if you're just going to be using it as a gimmick within a DS game, it'll probably be okay. But I think if you are going to be playing DS games, you're probably better off playing single-screen games that rely on actual controls. Now, when it comes to 3DS, we do have quite a few more options. One of the best things about this console in particular is that it didn't rely so much on touchscreen controls compared to the original DS. And so the vast majority of the games will be able to work with the actual controls here, and so that's going to be great. In addition, this chipset is able to handle 3DS pretty well. I would say most games will play at a 2x resolution, and they're going to look pretty good. And you've got a bunch of different layout options when it comes to 3DS. So I've set it up for my right stick toggle. So if I click on this, you can see that I can toggle between my different options. Honestly, none of these are really going to be perfect. I think that having just a single screen is probably going to be your best bet. But like with DS, there are going to be games where you want to see that second screen as well. So I would say that yes, even though these games are going to play pretty well, it is also a bit of a compromised experience just because having to show two screens on a 4x3 device like this is never going to be a perfect fit. But I do think it's going to be an enjoyable experience depending on the type of game that you're actually trying to play, and I think something like Mario 2 is going to be a good fit. Now, when it comes to home console systems, especially those that played in a 4x3 aspect ratio, this is where the device is really going to shine. Even when you go back to the 8-bit era, I found this to be a really excellent example. It's not going to be a perfect integer scale, but it will be relatively close. If we look at the life bar here in Mega Man 2, you can see that, yeah, it's not a perfect fit. There's a little bit of pixel wobble in the sense that it's not perfect when it comes to the balance here. But of course, there are many different tricks that you can use, including interpolation shaders, to really fix this effect if you would like. One of the easiest examples to fix it would be to turn on an integer scale, and a 3x integer scale is not quite full screen, but it is pretty close. You can see the black bars around the edges are not half bad when we turn on integer scaling. So it's going to be all up to you whether or not you don't mind having those black bars around the screen, or maybe you don't mind having imbalanced pixels. And then of course you can also use a special shader to fix that as well. And I recently made an entire shaders video and guide, and I went into all this stuff, and all of the things that I talked about in that video are going to apply with this device as well. For example, in that video, I spent a lot of time talking about applying a CRT effect like this. So what I'm using here is an interpolation shader to be able to balance out the pixels. Then underneath it, I'm using a bloom effect just to give it a little bit more of a softer edge. And then on top of that, I'm layering a CRT effect, which gives me some scan lines, and then also gives it a little bit of curvature around the edges. Of course, this will all be up to you, but the nice thing about this device is that it has enough power to be able to layer on a bunch of different shaders and filters on top. And I think that working with a 4-inch screen like this is going to give you a little bit more room to work with, and so you can really see these effects a little bit better. But rest assured, if you're only looking for a nice crunchy effect when it comes to playing these retro pixel-based systems, it's still going to look really good here because we have that higher resolution to work with. And so even though some of these systems will not be a perfect integer scale right out of the box, it's still going to look pretty good and balanced. In other words, if you're looking for a somewhat plug-and-play experience when it comes to having nice visual effects, then I think having a 720p resolution like this just gives you more room to work with. Now, when it comes to these 3D-based systems, PlayStation, Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, I generally will play these at a 2x upscale, and so they still look really good, but still have a little bit of chunkiness to them as well. I love the fact that because it's a 4x3 aspect ratio display, everything is going to fit really well. And of course, we've got plenty of performance power to be able to play these systems with no issue, even within RetroArch. Now, like I mentioned before, having a true analog stick on this device, especially when playing games that relied on analog stick controls like the Nintendo 64, this is going to be a lot better on this device compared to others from Anbernic. And there really is no comparison between having a true analog stick on a game like Cruis'n USA versus trying to play this game with a Nintendo Switch style Joy-Con, which never really seems to be a very good fit. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that many Nintendo 64 games will not actually blow up to full screen when using RetroArch as the emulator. And that's because many of these games actually had built-in bezels in order to help with just the overall processing power of the Nintendo 64. Thankfully, there's a pretty easy way to fix this. And essentially what you have to do is you have to go into the RetroArch settings, then set the aspect ratio to custom. From there, you'll want to expand the width and height of the screen to be able to match the display itself, and then you'll have to move the position of the X and Y as well in order to make it fit perfectly within the center. It's going to take some experiment, and it's going to be different by game, but you can see here with F-Zero X, I have to adjust this quite a bit. And honestly, this may not be perfect pixel by pixel, but it's close enough for me, and it allows me to blow it up to a full screen. And so if you do try to play a Nintendo 64 game via RetroArch specifically, and it isn't filling up the whole screen, this is what you need to do. And once you've got that configured the way you want per game, then go into the quick menu, then go into overrides, and then save it as a save game override. This means that anytime you boot up that specific game, it's going to remember those video settings, and so you won't have to do this any other time. It can be a little bit annoying to do that for every single game, but the nice thing is you only have to do it that one time, and then from then on, everything is going to look great. And like I mentioned, just about every Nintendo 64 game is going to play fine, even at an upscaled resolution, and even when using RetroArch. And the reason why I like using this emulator over something like a standalone one is because I have all those universal hotkeys and retro achievements, all the things that come with playing with RetroArch. And of course, same thing when it comes to Sega Dreamcast. We're going to be able to play this at an upscaled resolution, even within RetroArch, and it's still going to play in full speed. And so this is really going to be an excellent experience here as well. Of course, you can always use a standalone emulator, but I like having everything in just one neat little package. Now, as we start moving into the harder to play systems like Sega Saturn, we are going to have a bit of a compromise here or there. It really is going to depend on what your goals are when it comes to Sega Saturn emulation. If we're just talking about getting games to play, then you can use the standalone Yabasanshiro emulator or even the Yabasanshiro core within RetroArch, which is what I'm doing here. It's not going to be the most accurate emulator, but most games will play at full speed. Just bear in mind, I'm not doing any sort of emulation upscale, so this is running at an original resolution, which honestly, I kind of like when it comes to Sega Saturn anyway. But if you wanted to try like the Beetle Saturn core, there are going to be a lot fewer games that will play at full speed. Some will, but it won't be the majority. So I would say if you're looking for a perfect Saturn experience, this is not going to be a great fit. You will probably end up having to spend quite a bit more money for a faster processor. But if you're really just looking to play a few games, which is generally what I like to do, then I think it'll be just fine. Now, I think the big standout point of the RG406V and the other two devices that Anbernic have released with the same chipset are the fact that these are reliably good when it comes to playing GameCube and PS2. They're not going to be a perfect experience. You're going to have to spend more than the $150 to $160 that this device is going to cost. But I think for this price point, the amount of gameplay that you can get from GameCube and PS2 is still pretty good. And I've spent a good amount of time talking about the kind of performance you can expect on the Unisoc T820 chipset in my previous reviews with this same chip, so the 556 as well as the RG Cube. And it's going to be the exact same result with this device. That means that most GameCube games will play at a 2x resolution, although there will be some that you'll have to drop down to just the native 1x. But bear in mind, because we're working with a 720p resolution display, you're not going to want to go beyond 2x. In fact, 1.5x is going to be perfect for this one, but unfortunately Dolphin doesn't have that option. So instead, the easiest thing to do is just set it to a 2x resolution, and depending on the game that you're playing, it will probably play at full speed. And then of course, if it doesn't run at full speed with a 2x resolution, just drop it down to a native 1x. The other compromise when it comes to playing GameCube is that we don't have analog input. So what I generally do is I set within the button mapping for the L1 to be the analog input and then the L2 to be the full digital input. This means that in games like Super Mario Sunshine, you're going to use R1 to be able to spray your water while moving around, and then you'll use R2 to remain stationary while also squirting that water. So it's not a perfect setup when it comes to those analog inputs, but I think it will work for most games. And other than that, I would say the only other main adjustment you'll have to do within Dolphin when playing GameCube is switching between OpenGL and Vulkan backends depending on the game. For the most part, I usually can just play everything with the Vulkan backend, but there will be certain games like Mario Kart Double Dash that will require OpenGL. But overall, I really enjoyed playing Nintendo GameCube games on this device. Because we have that native 4:3 aspect ratio display, everything is going to fill out perfectly. One thing to keep in mind, if you try to use Auto or Force 4:3, you will find that it's not actually going to fill out the screen. Instead, you will have black bars on the left and right. So for example, here with Mario Tennis, you can see there's just these faint lines on each side, and that's because I have it set to Auto or 4:3. Meanwhile, if you use the stretch to window setting within the aspect ratio options, then you can see that it actually will fill out the whole screen. I think it looks a lot better. So personally, that's what I have set as the default within the Dolphin settings. And if you're trying to get an idea in terms of performance, I would say that basically everything up to Metroid Prime will generally play at a full 2x resolution. Anything beyond that, for example F-Zero GX, will not play at full speed. And there is one neat trick that you can do within Dolphin to get an idea of how well a game is going to play. If you go into the graphics settings and turn on the metrics, you can see here that it'll show speed, but then also below that it'll say max. And essentially the max speed will give you an idea of how close it's getting to being bogged down. So here you can see that it's well above 100% in the max speed, which gives me an idea that this game in particular, which is Metroid Prime, won't really go below 100% unless there's a lot of things happening on screen. Other games might show you like 200%, which means they're going to run even better. And so Metroid Prime is a game for me that I would say is mostly playable. There's going to be a couple slowdowns here and there, but overall I would find this to be a very enjoyable experience. Meanwhile, if you get to a game that's a lot harder to play, like Rogue Squadron 2, you can see that it's hovering around 100% at the max, which means that yeah, this is going to struggle to play at full speed at a 2x resolution. And honestly, even when dropping this game down to a 1x resolution, it still is going to struggle to play at full speed. And so I would definitely say that this one is probably not going to be fully playable. The fact that we're having slowdown in the title screen just says a lot about what you can expect from the actual gameplay. And sure enough, yeah, when you get into the actual gameplay, you can feel that this game is struggling to play at full speed. There will be quite a few slowdowns. So I think this is a good example of the fact that Nintendo GameCube emulation is not going to be perfect on this device. There will definitely be games that don't play at full speed, but I would say the vast majority are still going to be playable. It's going to take a little bit more performance power to be able to play something like Rogue Squadron 2. But I think when all is said and done, I'm still comfortable in calling this device GameCube friendly. It's not going to be able to play every single GameCube game, but man, there are so many that play well, and this is going to be a joy to actually use. Now, one thing worth noting when it comes to playing Nintendo Wii, there is one configuration change that I recommend doing. So go into Config within Dolphin and then Wii, and you're going to want to turn this option for widescreen off. It's going to be on by default. This is going to allow you to be able to play games that support 4:3 in actual 4:3 aspect ratio. A good example of this would be Sonic Colors. This is a game that will run in widescreen if you have that turned on, but if you turn it off, you can see that it's going to play in 4:3, and I think it looks great. So I would definitely experiment with whatever Wii games you want to play and see if they support 4:3. I know another game that works really well in that regard is going to be Mario Kart Wii. Also bear in mind this game is playing at a 2x resolution, so it is looking really good and also playing at full speed. Just bear in mind it's not going to be a perfect experience. For example, here with New Super Mario Bros. Wii, you can see that even with the 4:3 aspect ratio setting turned on, it's still playing the game in a widescreen format. So this does mean that you're going to get a little bit of a smaller screen altogether, but I still think it's going to be totally playable. In terms of performance, I would say that fewer games are going to play at a 2x resolution compared to GameCube, but still many will. It's really going to come down to the game that you're playing, and so for example here with New Super Mario Bros., it's playing at a 2x resolution, no problem. But other games like Super Mario Galaxy, yeah, this one cannot play at full speed at a 2x resolution. You can see it's averaging about 43 frames per second here altogether. But if you drop it down to a native resolution, you can see that it's mostly going to play at full speed. You'll get some slowdowns here and there depending on what's happening on screen, but I would say that this is going to be mostly playable by comparison. So it's really going to come down to the game that you're trying to play and whether or not it's going to be a good fit for you, but yeah, I would definitely play Mario Galaxy with this kind of setup. Okay, and finally, the last system I want to talk about when it comes to emulation is going to be PlayStation 2. Now, this one's very similar to the GameCube in that most games will play fairly well, but we do have a few other considerations to keep in mind. The first big difference is that we have 0.25 increments when it comes to upscaling, and so 1.5 native is actually going to be the ideal resolution to use when playing on this specific screen. Depending on the game, that'll get us pretty close to the full 720p resolution. You can bump it up even more if you're really trying to max it out, but I found this to be the best balance when it comes to performance as well as graphical fidelity. So in general, what I do is I play these games at a 1.5x resolution, and then if they are struggling to maintain that full speed, then I'll drop it down to 1.25 or even just 1.0. And I would say it's going to be about half and half depending on which games will play at 1.5x and then those that'll play better at a 1x resolution instead. If I had to give it a specific milestone, I would say that Ratchet & Clank plays pretty well at a 1.5x resolution. And so any game that runs more easily than Ratchet & Clank is probably going to play at full speed at 1.5x or even higher. It's going to be pretty similar with other 3D-based games like Jak and Daxter. This one runs pretty well at a 1.5x resolution. It's not going to be perfect, but I would say that this game, along with Ratchet & Clank, are generally playable at the 1.5x resolution, and I think it looks pretty great. Other games like Sly Cooper are very close, but they just don't quite get there. Especially when you get in certain parts, you'll get a lot of bogging down, and so I wouldn't consider this to be fully playable, but it is very close, at least at a 1.5x resolution. If you drop it down to a 1x resolution, it gets better, but still not perfect. You can see that it will slow down from time to time. And I think this is a good example game when it comes to PlayStation 2 emulation writ large on this chipset. Not every game is going to play perfectly, but if you're willing to live with a little bit of slowdown here and there, you can still probably get some pretty good experiences. It'll all come down to what you're willing to live with when it comes to gameplay on PS2. To give you one more example, I would say that God of War 2 is also an excellent fit. This one can play at a 1x resolution, and for the most part, it will play at full speed. You will have some slowdown here and there, but again, I would generally say this is going to be playable at this 1x resolution. So it's really going to come down to how badly you want to play some of these PS2 games and whether or not you're willing to live with a little bit of compromise. In general, I would say that PS2 is just harder to emulate compared to Nintendo GameCube and Nintendo Wii. Of course, bear in mind that in addition to changing out things like the graphical backend as well as the resolution, you can always go and use like underclocking to be able to change the game even more. But for me personally, I don't like making a lot of those adjustments just because it starts to change the overall feel of the game. So even though I'm pretty comfortable in saying that this is a GameCube friendly device, it's a little bit less friendly when it comes to PS2. But even with all those caveats in mind, it's still pretty awesome to be able to play PS2 games on a handheld like this and for under $200. Okay, one other thing worth noting, because we've got a 5 GHz Wi-Fi connection, you will be able to use this for game streaming. Just bear in mind that most streaming apps are going to default to having a 16:9 aspect ratio, which means you're going to have black bars at the top and bottom. Like with PSP, we're going to get about 3.7 inches of game when it comes to a 16:9 aspect ratio on a 4:3 screen. Also bear in mind there will be other compromises when trying to do game streaming. For example, because we don't have analog triggers, that means we're going to have a digital input when it comes to games like Forza Horizon. This means you're either going to be flooring the gas or you're going to be taking your foot off the gas, and there's no in between. And so that does ruin some of the nuance of playing a racing game like this. Now, when it comes to playing a first-person shooter game, something like Doom Eternal, this one's a little bit awkward because of the placement of the thumbsticks as well as the triggers behind. I would say you can definitely get the job done, but it does feel like a compromised experience. It just doesn't feel natural like it does when using an actual controller. So I think when you combine this all into one, the fact that 16:9 displays are going to look a little bit small on the screen, and the fact that we don't have analog triggers on the back, and then also, of course, just the weird placement of the sticks when it comes to playing more modern games, this is definitely a compromised experience if you did want to do game streaming on this handheld. Personally, I think I'd rather just play those type of games on a phone with a telescopic controller as opposed to trying to play it on the RG406V. It feels like you're trying to squeeze extra functionality into a system that just really isn't built for it. Okay, I think that's it when it comes to overall testing. Let's start summarizing and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Anbernic RG406V. And I think most importantly, we should talk about the 2 new updates that they have in terms of sticks and screen. I'm super happy that they're finally moving away from the analog sticks that they have used previously, which were essentially just knockoffs from the Nintendo Switch. These new sticks have a full range of motion, and the software seems to be updated as well because we're not having any sort of cardinal snapping or all of the other issues we've seen previously. So hands down, this is the best analog stick experience that I've seen from Anbernic to date. In addition, I really like this new screen. Not only is it 4 inches in size, which I think is perfect for a 4:3 display, but it also has an upgraded 960 by 720 resolution, which just gives us a lot more room to work with when it comes to scaling. Now, for the rest of the points that I like about this device, we have seen this stuff before. For example, this is a comfortable device, and it's almost exactly the same shell that we've seen in another comfortable device, which was the RG405V. It's definitely a chunky boy, and that's something we'll talk about here in a moment, but by virtue of having all of that extra space, it does mean that it's just a lot easier to grab and hold. I also appreciate the power profile that we're getting here. The Unisoc T820 is a pretty darn good chip. And I think that Anbernic priced it just about right. It's $165 retail, but they will often be selling it for cheaper. For example, during the first pre-order period, they're going to knock it off by $10. And I think that putting it between the $150 and $200 price point is just about right in terms of performance that we can expect on this chipset. I also think the battery life on here is pretty darn good. We can expect anywhere from 4 to 8 hours of gameplay depending on what you're playing. When it comes down to it, the RG406V is a culmination of a lot of the things that Anbernic has been working on over the years, And it's pretty great that this is probably one of the first devices I've seen from them that really just have no deal breakers. In most other cases, there's always some sort of compromise that you have to accept in order to get the latest and greatest from them. And I think that with the introduction of these new sticks as well as this new high resolution screen, I really don't have much to complain about. However, it wouldn't be a Retro Game Core video if I didn't have some things to complain about, so I've got two that I came up with. The first thing is that it just has a pretty bulky design. This is the same thing that we saw with the 405V. If you're going to be keeping it at home and not really traveling around with it, I think it's a pretty good couch device because it's comfortable but then also is reminiscent of a Game Boy. And so it does scratch that itch when it comes to nostalgia as well as just being pretty comfortable to hold. However, this is not a device that I would consider to be very portable other than throwing it into a backpack because it's not something you can easily put into your pocket. A lot of that has to do with those analog sticks because they stick out quite a bit. And when you combine that with the chunky grips on the back, it just makes it for a non-pocketable experience. In addition to the overall bulky design, I also feel like the bezels around the device feel a little bit dated and chunky. Just last month, Anbernic released a device that had a really sleek look to it, really thin bezels, and reminded me of the analog pocket, but maybe a little bit upgraded. Meanwhile, this device feels like something that is misplaced in time, and that it came from the 90s but is showing up in 2024. And to be honest, when we put together that kind of bulky or bloated look, along with these chunky bezels, it is probably one of my least favorite form factors and overall designs from Anbernic over the past couple years. And obviously that's all based on my own personal taste, but I do think it is a pretty polarizing design. To put it all together into one sentence, I would say that the Anbernic RG406V is a contradictory handheld. By that I mean that it has all the features that I would hope for in a device around this price point, but it's also collected together into a package that I found to be the least interesting of all the Anbernic devices I've seen this year. So when it comes down to it, I think the 406V is an excellent handheld in its own right, but it does make me just want to wait for the next release from Anbernic. After all, I do expect that we'll probably see a couple more before the year is through. And so my hope is that the 406V is just an indication of what's to come from this company. What I really want to see is some of the other tried and true designs they've used previously, but with these new sticks and the new screen. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are the incremental upgrades of the RG406V worth picking up, or is it worth just waiting and seeing if a better design comes out in the future? For my part, I'm having a hard time recommending this device. Even though all of the components seem to work really well, I do think your money might be better spent waiting for the next couple releases to see what they come up with. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.